Thank you very much, Evelyn. And I wanted to thank the committee for inviting me back today to talk about John Hamilton. At first, we might not think there's much connection here between that and the ridge, but as I go through, I think you'll be able to see that there is a connection. I'm going to start in by giving a little bit of background to lead into this, because as I was doing my work on Black veterans of the First World War, I kept bumping into other sort of side stories, and one of those particular stories that came up was looking at the sports side related to Black history in the Fredericton area. And that took me to a group called the Fredericton Celestials. And it was the first all-Black baseball team that was created in the 1890s, actually around 1891-92, by a group of men who hung out together in a minstrel group called the Celestials. And they had their rooms, as they called them, for practice in the Barker House Alley in downtown. One of the members of that group was a Hamilton. And it led me, in doing the background of these people and the baseball members, to looking into the Hamilton line. And soon I was back in St. John, where many of them were found. And so it led me eventually to his uncle, John Henry Hamilton, on the west side of St. John. And I found that John Henry Hamilton was one of the first generation of Black community members who were born from a free slave, Edward Hamilton, who came out of New York State. He actually may have been what is called the post-1812 movement of Black settlers into New Brunswick, the most pronounced being that at Loch Lomond. But there were many who came up and simply moved upriver, applied for land or grants that they could get, or moved their way into urban areas like Fredericton or St. John. Edward, with his background in masonry, actually took up on the west side of St. John, at that time simply called Carleton, and started to raise his family, a fairly large family of about 8 members. And John Henry was one of the older boys in the family. And they, like their father, followed those trades, several of them being masons, others being carpenters like John Henry, but also all of them having experience in blacksmithing. And of course, in St. John on the west side at that time, living near Rodney and Watson streets where they did in the 1860s, soon John Henry was actually practicing the art of a shipwright and using his blacksmithing and carpentry knowledge for that. With the beginnings of the railways and the building up of lines and the need for more and more maintenance, they established a shop in the west side of St. John for the new European and North American Railway. And soon, John Henry and his brother Walter had worked their way into the shop because of their blacksmithing skills. And by 1870, they were well established in that shop. 1870 is actually a critical point for both St. John and Fredericton in railway history, because with the rapid expansion that had started in places like Fredericton, St. Andrews, and along towards Moncton, many trunk lines began to open up. And one of those, after the line had first been put into Fredericton, was to build a line from what is now Fredericton Junction, then called Hart's Mills, and moved that branch line into downtown Fredericton. And the Fredericton branch line was completed in 1869. With that happening, the focal point for maintenance and building shifted from the south to the middle of the province. And so it ended up that John Hamilton and his brother actually were seconded to head up the entire building and maintenance shop that was established in downtown Fredericton. And I'm going to show you a map of that area where this is 1878. I hope everybody can see that, showing the downtown area on the town plat. And Charlotte Street was really the cutoff point in 1878, and the rest was principally fields and grazing areas and college land. But as you can distinctly see, the railroad
Can I interrupt, Roger?
Yes.
We don't see a map.
You don't see a map. Let's see. Guess I'm trying to share this, but if someone can advise me on the sharing.
Roger, there's a green square at the center bottom of your screen.
Yes.
Share screen.
Oh,
We did that
yes.
earlier.
Right. Yep. There we go.
Okay, great. We see a map now.
Is it a full size now?
Yes, it's a lot bigger now.
Okay. As you can see from this downtown, you can see the original town plat of Fredericton from Queen and the river up to about Charlotte Street. And that's was as far as it extended. And behind it, the Fredericton Junction Branch Railroad came into York Street, where the station is today now part of the liquor store on York Street. But the rail line actually extended a little bit more than that into the Victoria area towards what we now call Smythe Street. But on that same ground at the end of the rail line was the old exhibition building, which in the 1870s burned and soon moved to the other side of Smythe, and a racetrack that they had right next to it, as you can see there. But the depot and building and maintenance section for the whole line was at that stop where where the station is, and that remained that way for about a dozen years. The next impetus was to actually build the Fredericton Railway train bridge, and as soon as that was completed, then lines started moving upriver, and so we get that movement that starts upriver towards Keswick. Now I'm going to wrong way. I'm going to show you a couple of the Keswick maps. This is 1878 as well. And coming upriver from Douglas, we can follow the rail line for the new New Brunswick Railway all the way up to the mouth of Keswick and at the turn, and then following on to Burt's Corner. Now, at that particular time, even the activity, even in the 1870s, was starting to pick up a great deal at the mouth of Keswick, because that they started building hotels and the equivalent of bed and breakfast, because they had to meet coaches or step off the train for an overnight train to in another location. So that became a very, very active center. Hard to believe that today, but by the 1890s, there were actually 7 hotels at that corner. And I know Heather and I have talked extensively about some of them. And you can still see the vestiges of some of the hotels that were on both sides of the road, going from the current strip mall up to the church. But that was very active. And then again, this is an expanded view showing the road system up to Kingsley and other areas. But I wanted to show you then north of Burt's Corner, took you all the way up to Zealand and beyond. So in the period that Hamilton was living, with the 1870s, there was a huge fever for every community to want a whistle stop for the train, because it meant economic prosperity in their eyes to be able to have that kind of activity and reach in through the back roads of the county. So you have that happening. At that time, when Hamilton arrived in Fredericton, he and his brother had already been working on a variety of different things, because it being a fairly new industry, there was a lot of innovation that needed to be done in order to handle the new locomotives and other components of the car system and the tracks. And so it was at that point that John Henry, being the more innovative of the two, came up with the invention we're going to talk about. And in this photograph we have here, you can see the original exhibition building in the background that was down in that area, and here the locomotive on the tracks. And some of you will recognize a familiar figure over to the right, the white bearded Boss Gibson of Marysville. And next to him is the station master, Fred Edgecombe. They were not only pals, but partners, and involved in the Bridge Corporation, involved in the lines for the New Brunswick Railway. And he and Fred Edgecombe later became superintendent for the New Brunswick Railway. But at this time with Hamilton, he was essentially Hamilton's upper management boss, you might call him. Reporting to him was the foreman of the building and maintenance shop, a guy named John Henry Miller. Lots of Henrys here. And so Walter and John Henry Hamilton got most of their orders for all of the lines through John Edward Miller. It so happened, and I think it may have started in St. John, that John Henry Hamilton felt that there was a need to make improvements on locomotives. One of the biggest problems, of course, was facing the winter. With the invention of the cow catcher, some of that was resolved, in which it would clear the way along the tracks of both debris as well as rocks and so on, and even cattle, of course, thus the name cow catcher. But the other problem that arose that was invented during this period was proper windows for the cabs to keep the weather out, but also building them structurally so they would withstand things that they could remove from the tracks. One of the sore points was facing the winters, because it would actually mean the incidence of derailment due to the amount of snow and ice that would pack on it. And so they came up with a number of minor inventions which didn't seem to do the job. But it appears that around 1872, while John and his brother were still in St. John, they had actually prototyped a flanger. And a flanger, simply speaking, is a device that was put on the front of the cow catcher. And in this particular shot, I have zeroed in, and you will see from this, I'll just increase it. You'll see from this, there are two substantial blades coming down from the cow catcher held by rods. And if you look closely at those, they are just a fraction of an inch above the rails, and they have a very sharp indented blade, one on each side. Then those rods go up to a lever system and then back to the locomotive, where the operator would be able to raise or lower those depending on the situation. And he could control them with a spring action that could get him within fractions of an inch of the rails. And by doing that, he could only clear snow, and it was originally called a snow clearer. The flanger actually could peel the ice off the tracks if it began to form, and that was one of the biggest headaches for most of the operators of the early locomotives. So in the period from 1872 into about the fall of 1873, they finally came up with the final version and the drawings. At that time, whether he felt he could apply or somebody had put the idea in his head, it was decided this was a great boon to the locomotives on any line anywhere in North America. And the place to get a patent for that and get recognition was in the United States because of the huge rail system that had already developed there. And so John Henry apparently applied, but before he could even get an application letter in, it was determined by the Commissioner of Patents that somebody who was Black could not apply for a patent. Particularly, the excuse was used if they were related or connected in any family way with somebody who was formerly a slave. Now, this was the commissioner's own interpretation. This was not the law of the land, but the commissioner held great sway over this. And so no application was entertained from John Henry Hamilton. Well, within that same period, his foreman, Miller, had come in, and I'm just going to reach for a file here. James Henry. I keep getting the names interspersed, but James Henry Miller had come forward as his foreman and said, well, he would apply essentially on his behalf to get the patent. And I've been able to actually, within the system, it took quite a lot, but within the system, I was able to begin to track when the patent came into existence, because there was some debate as to when it took place. There's an actual letter on file in which it was applied as an invention for a track clearer, not a flanger at the time, in which it was applied for by letter on the 27th of December, 1872. So it's sometime before that that John Henry and his brother had come up with the prototype. Miller had applied for this on his own, and the letter was received in the office in January. And in May of 1873, it was granted as a patent. But the granting of the patent was given the name the Miller Flanger, not the Hamilton Flanger. Now, Miller had proposed, and I hear several, well, I shouldn't say here, I've read several stories by some leading authorities on the railway history of New Brunswick. One of the ones that I knew, who knew all about the early railways around Fredericton, was Fred Phillips. And Fred later became archivist in charge of photographs at the Provincial Archives. And he tells the story that is actually based on this photograph I'm just showing you, which, sorry. drop that back down. In this photograph, which we know now is taken in 1875 with a flanger in place. It's not very long after Miller received the patent, but even as early as December of 1872, the Bangor Daily Wake, of all papers, had picked up the news that Miller had applied for this invention, giving Miller credit for the flanger. Now, it is purported by Fred Phillips and backed up by Major Anderson. C. Warren Anderson was a real railway buff, and particularly of the Fredericton branch line. And in some of his early writings, he refers to the fact that Fred Edgecombe, as station manager, also backed up Miller in getting the invention. And it was said that they came to some sort of settlement with Hamilton. There is nothing in any legal agreements, in any kind of agreements or any kind of correspondence that I have found that he ever got credit. And so it appears that Mr. Edgecombe and Miller decided that with the need for this particular flanger, and it looked like there was a great market for it, they proposed to a number of other investors to form a company called the Miller Flanger Manufacturing Company. And it was in 1875 that they formed up this company. And this is where it begins to become interesting, because it begins to tie in a number of people that reach across York County and even up to Keswick. The actual application was given approval for the corporation in April of that year. And when they formed it up, there were essentially 5 investors in the company. Henry Miller, of course, Frederick Edgecombe at the time, Thomas Temple, who at the time was the High Sheriff of York County, but he was also later on to become a member of Parliament, and a very important figure in the life of Fredericton. All of you may be aware, or some of you may be aware, that the lasting memory of Thomas Temple is found in the fountain. Some called it a fountain for horses to stop by and drink from, but it's located in front of the Beaverbrook Hotel and the art gallery just in between. And there's a plaque there on the side of the fountain. He put it up himself to himself in 1889, one of his last duties as an MP. But Temple held great sway in the county, politically, socially, economically. Joining him was Archibald Fitzrandolph, who in 1864, with all the people I mentioned, and about 24 other shareholders, formed the People's Bank of New Brunswick. The People's Bank of New Brunswick location is approximately where Harvey Studios stands today on Queen Street. And it was along that area. It was eventually absorbed by the Bank of Montreal and moved. The last person of Keswick interest was John Pickard, who was an MP at the time. He was a leading merchant in the lumber industry and mills, made his wealth there, and his partner was Thomas Temple. And all of them joined together, in which they had issued shares so that the capital, the capital stock of the company was $200,000, with it being at $100 a share. Not many people could afford that in the day, to buy into such a company, except people of this wealth level. So Miller was the key, because then he had the knowledge to be able to make the flanger. Now, the Hamiltons were still working at the shop, and whether they were seconded into starting to build some of the flangers for a manufacturing operation, we're not sure. They had to find a location for this. And one of the locations that they eventually established, and they let Miller take the lead on this, was land that he bought up at the time, which is now where the old Daily Gleaner building is at Phoenix Square. That was owned by the Atherton family and later by members of the Kitchen family. And Miller bought some of the area, and along with a brother and the background of his father's company, W.E. Miller and Sons, which was in the grocery business, they established the manufacturing company in that location. Now, it appears that everything went along quite robustly in the first decade or so, enough so that by 1881, they actually took out a Canadian patent with improvements on the flanger, still called the Miller Flanger. Coming back to our friends in the workshop, John and Walter continued on in the city, and with other family members, in tracing their genealogy, I know that members of their families married in to several of the Black community that have been settled for a long time in the area. And they had ties with the McCarthys, with the McIntyres, with the Peters from Spring Hill, and a number of other families that joined in with them. And their wives were even tied to families like the O'Rees. So going back to Boyd Hamilton, the nephew of John Henry, we can see close connections there along the way. However, whether John Henry got disillusioned and Walter himself, they actually returned to St. John. And they were still working at the shop there. They had masonry skills as well, and they worked on many bridges and connections with the railroad. But really, their ties with the flanger ended at that very point. And so it ended up that the success of building the flanger and the orders carried on. And we don't have the business books to demonstrate what actually happened to the number of flangers and the success of it. But from newspapers reports well into the late 1880s and even into the early 1990s, the flanger was being used all over North America, ordered up for locomotives. There are tenders coming from Western Canada that call for the flangers. So we know they were a success. How wealthy or how much profit was made from them over the years for their shareholders, we don't know. Henry Miller, however, he seemed to fall on hard times himself personally. His grocery wholesale chain fell into bad times. He borrowed heavily against it. And before it was over, Mr. Fitzrandolph and Thomas Temple owned the bulk of the company. And it ended up that he actually went insolvent with W.E. Miller and Son and moved from Fredericton in the mid to late 1890s and went all the way to St. Paul, Minnesota. He detached himself from the manufacturing company. Whether he sold his shares or what he had as shares, I'm not certain. But it was sort of, perhaps it was karma, I'm not sure, that if Miller did not reach agreement with Hamilton, he met his own end financially because he mismanaged what he had. And by the early 90s, there were signs that the flanger was not being used as much. Railroad people tell me that that by the time they invented the modern signal system with the red and yellow, the red and green lights along the trackways to indicate trains coming and going or approaching, The flanger became came to have a negative connotation. Part of it was due to the fact that before the advent of the signal system, the front of the locomotive and on the track, they had what they called a signal torpedo. This was something built onto the track, and I've never seen one, so I'm not exactly sure how to describe it. But with the actual approaching locomotive going over this, it would sound and smoke. And because they didn't travel at great speeds, it would actually give a forewarning that there was a locomotive on the track coming in their direction. Anyway, it meant the demise of the flanger, because the flanger was so close to the track, it was tearing these little torpedo signals off the track. And so when the new invention of the signal system with the lights came into being, that was the end of that innovation with the flanger. So I'm going to follow up with a little bit of what happened to John Henry Hamilton, because through all of the system going up the valley on both sides, the flanger was in full use by all the locomotives going up to the Miramichi and down to Moncton. And we know there must have been a substantial number of them that were done. There's an actual flanger that was found in the back of a warehouse on Westmoreland Street in 1953. And I don't know where it's housed, but it was originally in the collection of Major Anderson, and there was a photograph of it. But John Henry went back and his brother Walter tried to make some go of it in St. John, but it was not to happen in that side of the railway. So both of them moved down to the Boston, Cambridge area of Massachusetts, and they soon were able to get jobs, blacksmithing and masonry work with maintenance and other divisions of a lot of the lines in the Massachusetts area. It's been said in various reports that both the brothers reached acclaim for the innovative side of a lot of things in the industry for locomotives and cars and trackways. I am not aware of any actual inventions patented and whether they could have been, but I'm still on the trail of that. At the present time, though, unfortunately, even when I traced all the land records of West St. John and all of the other possible areas where John Henry and Walter would have settled, I can only find the small lot that was left to them by their father Edward in West St. John, and that they were renting out to descendants of the family. They never returned to New Brunswick, and in the mid-1890s, Walter died first in '94, followed by John Henry at the age of 62 in 1896. And to my knowledge, neither one of them gained any fortune at all in even the most meager way from this whole process. They were simply duped out of their invention as far as I can see, and they were not given credit. And although sort of safe words like a settlement was reached, at one time it was said that John Henry tried to take legal action against the manufacturing company to get something from it, but unable to raise the funds for a lawyer, he discontinued the action. I have no second source to be able to prove that, but at the present time, that looks like the situation. So in the end, they not only lost the patent, but they also lost even the name to the flanger. And so their experience was not good. And within the family, I haven't been able to find anybody that refers to the Hamilton Flanger. There are descendants in Fredericton and St. John of the family, but most of them are not aware that John Henry and his brother Walter has had this success in developing innovative tools and apparatus for the trains. Even to this day, the Miller Flanger name is still used in tourist information in the city of Fredericton. And if you go on the site of New Brunswick today.ca, I think it is, you'll see that this date in history in May, they announced the invention by Mr. Miller of the Miller Flanger. But unfortunately, John Henry did not get that. In conclusion, basically, what it tells me is there more of the story and the experience of many of the Black community has to be told and show exactly what happened to them. I have been doing this with some other business people in St. John, and I'm happy to report that I have two of my Black business people, one a woman, Georgina Wetzel, and one a man, Thomas C. Washington, who both have now been accepted by the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, and I hope their biographies would be coming out sometime in June. Georgina Wetzel became a dominant power in the late 19th century in the ice business in St. John, drawing her ice from Lily Lake and having a monopoly on the business right up to 1900. She died a millionaire in terms of the dollars of the day. And Thomas C. Washington was an outstanding restaurateur and supporter of sports. I first came to meet him through the pages of doing the sport history of the first Black baseball team, the Royals in St. John. And so more of these stories have to be told about the background of the Black experience in New Brunswick if we're going to have a better understanding of what happened to their lives and how it's impacting what is happening in the modern day. So I hope it throws a little bit of light on that. I didn't cast too much on the Ridge, but certainly all of these folks who had experience along the train stations and the areas of the railway certainly in their day would have known about the invention, even if they hadn't known about Mr. Hamilton. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Roger. This has been great. I definitely have learned a few things that I didn't know before, or more than a few things. And we do have some questions in chat, and I've also jotted down a few questions myself that I'll give everybody else a chance to ask. So I'll scroll up to our first question. And I think it was from Russell Hunt. He asked, was there any kind of power assist on raising and lowering the flanger?
To my knowledge, and I haven't seen the actual drawings, I've gotten the detailed flanger explanation blow by blow, and it refers to figures in it. Unfortunately, the records are scarce for the US Patent Office, and I'm hoping to find it. But according to the explanation, it was used a combination of levers and springs operated by the pilot in the cab. And he could actually move it fractions of an inch using the spring action. So no hydraulics appeared to be involved. Does that answer his question?
Well, we'll let Russ chime in if it doesn't, and we can follow it up. So the second question goes to Brenda Orr, and she asks, were the flangers made of cast iron or something else? And also, were you able to get copies of the patent design drawings? And I think you just answered that. She said these drawings can be quite detailed.
Yes, I'm still on the search for those. I've been able to find from the annual reports of the Commissioner of Patents the actual letter submitted in the beginning by Mr. Miller, and then his detailed description of how the system worked. And he refers to figure drawings. Now, the drawings are there somewhere, and I have to dig deeper to be able to see if I can find them. But often they publish these reports but the accompanying drawings were not included into it. I'm trying to get deep into the patent office to see if they carry the drawings for that earlier period. So I'm still on the hunt. As far as the makeup of it, according to, it appears that they would be of a cast material, but there was a lot of blacksmithing involved, in which shaping and cutting the tool and then sharpening the tool in the shop. And as I say, essentially John Henry Hamilton and his brother Walter were the two-man whole shop for building and maintenance for the line, the Fredericton branch line, and then the Brunswick railway line for many years. It wasn't until about 1880 that they actually created a separate division and built a bigger facility. So it was more like an oversized blacksmith shop.
Okay. And this is also a question I was going to ask too. Russ Hunt asks, were there alternate ways of clearing the snow that didn't interfere with the signal system? And were they competing inventions for clearing the snow at all?
I'm not a railway aficionado, so I can't answer it directly, but I know from reading the early material that was produced by Major Anderson and Fred Phillips and others that were in the railway magazines, that until the early railway signal system came along, there weren't many alternatives for clearing the snow. In many places, it would mean that they, if they were blocked by the snow, it meant they simply had to stop. They might stop at the nearest station or drop-off point for passengers, and I've read about this, and then allowed the crews to clear the snow so that the train could keep going on schedule. But many times trains were put behind schedule because there was too much manual clearing to be done. So the flanger was meant to clear small amounts of snow and as much as the cowcatcher would push aside. But it was really meant in those areas where the ice built up from the impact of the snow, and they had to get that ice off and not allow the front wheels of the train to derail.
Okay. Yeah, and I would just, like, I was recently reading a book on the account of the Halifax explosion, and I was quite amazed that even at that time, some of the trains that were rushing to get to Halifax with the relief efforts, they were blocked by snow in many different places, and it was manual labor. All available men basically had to jump off, grab a shovel, and shovel the track to get to inch the trains forward. So many years later, I don't think they had really even come up with much of an alternative.
No, I think it,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
even into the 1920s, I think it's the first period in which you see the rotary action locomotives, which would be placed on the front of it to be able to move snow off like a snow blower. And those were, even at the time, they were called flanger units. And they had a certain amount of capacity, and Western Canada is famous for those. When they were applied, I'm not sure, but I know they were more common in the 20s.
Okay, so it took a long time, that's for sure, to find something that could do this job.
I should add, talking about inventions, John Henry and his brother Walter weren't alone in getting inventions for the railway. Two of the most common inventions, we don't think about this, but apparently a New Brunswicker, Miramichier, was responsible for an innovative patent system to bag luggage and tag it so it wouldn't get lost. And another inventor in an earlier period was one in which he came up with a windshield for a locomotive, because the weather blowing in and freezing rain and frost were a big problem. He invented the equivalent of what I call the thermal window, because he used 2 layers of glass and he placed something in the center of it that would keep it from fogging up. And that was a big problem for many of the early locomotives. And both of those, I think he was from St. John, but both of those inventions are credited to New Brunswickers.
Wow. Yeah, it's when you think about all the things that could go wrong operating a train in the wintertime. Yeah, it's no wonder people were struggling to find something to invent to sort of to deal with the issue.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay. Then Brenda Orr comments on when you mentioned that you couldn't find a flanger in a museum collection, or she advised or commented that I would check the New Brunswick Museum collection for the flanger that was found in 1953, the one that was found in the warehouse. If you already haven't done so. And she said the Canadian Railway Museum would also be another possibility. And to that, I would also add maybe check the York Sunbury Historical Society collection if you haven't already done so.
Well, in fact, I knew Major Anderson back in the day, and we used to talk about railroad history and many other topics. And a lot of his material was donated to the York Sunbury, but there wasn't anything of this nature that turned up. Maybe it was too big, I don't know. The NBM collection possibly could have something, because they hold a great number of things from the old European and North American Railway, the predecessor to all of this. And when they opened the West Side depot for maintenance, that was an ENR location. So there may be a strong possibility that somebody may not know what it is when they look at it. And this is usually the problem. But I never thought of the Canadian Railway Museum because there could be another locomotive in another part of Canada that may have had a part that they donated to a museum at the end of its life.
It's us museum people now feel like we've got a challenge to check our collections.
Well, yes, and old barns too, because something like this was stuck in the back of a warehouse that was not intended for that. It was just a warehouse for a variety of things, mostly groceries. So check your back stores.
Yes, exactly. Now that I know what they are, I wouldn't be surprised if they were mislabeled as something else. And
yeah, oh, for sure.
Okay, let's scroll back up. And Helene has asked, how does signal lights replace the flanger if they just gave signals and the flanger was to remove the snow?
Well, as far as I know from the technology, the lights were much stronger, of course. They were more stable and off to the side of the track or above the track or overhanging the track. Whereas the flanger with these so-called torpedoes, they were the little torpedo signal was welded or wed with the track. And so they had to be constantly replacing them if a train was going in a certain direction. So I would imagine there would have been a high amount of maintenance. Whereas when they eventually invented and installed the light system to signal ahead, whether a train was coming from the other direction or on a similar track or on a side track, they began to build more and more side tracks so trains could pull off. There wasn't much of that in the early period. So a lot of the time, it was, I imagine there were a lot of near misses. So I don't know mechanically how the signal system worked in that regard, but it would send the signal back to a station or a location where they could alert them.
Okay. And then we've had a couple more suggestions for looking for the flanger, and Brenda Orr followed up by saying that somewhere else that could check is the New Brunswick Railway Museum in Hillsborough. They have a lot of large objects. And Phil Edwards commented that Heritage Park in Calgary has a lot of railway items. I'll look for that one. I'll look for one. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, that is a tremendous spot because I've been there in the past when I worked in Alberta, and they have a magnificent collection.
Okay. And Debbie has commented. She said, "Thank you for organizing your research findings in such an informative way, Roger. Very interesting. Growing up on Woodstock Road, our driveway crossed the south side rail line and the load of locomotive shook the house." So, yep, I can well imagine that would be true.
Well, in my early years, we lived part of our time in Fredericton Junction, and when it was an important junction center, there was a roundhouse located behind my grandfather's house on the line that started to turn north towards Fredericton. And all through the night when I stayed at my grandfather's, and he worked for the railroad as well, you could hear the trains shunting in and out, backing up and going forward as they were fixed or maintenance was applied. And so for the people in the junction, that was normal activity for decades. But of course, that's all gone now. The track is gone on that section of the roundhouse, and the roundhouse is gone. But there's a lot of that heritage which is passed, but some stations like Macadam and others have been preserved. And there's a lot of the rural ones that have had good attention and been preserved. So hopefully there'll be more writing about them because no one has done a definitive book on railroad stations and similar types of stops along the railroads of New Brunswick and the communities and their interaction with the community.
That's some research that needs to be done for sure. And Krista Higgins also comments, and my grandfather as well, Hazen Nason. Oh, maybe it's your granddaughter. Or thank you for this presentation. Excellent information. And I just had a couple questions of my own that came to my mind during the
Certainly.
presentation. And one was the connection between a mason and a blacksmith. To me, they're almost two separate trades. How was John Hamilton able to sort of transition from being a mason and learning masonry from his father to being a blacksmith?
I think it came at that period, and the records in St. John are very scant. You don't have any of the 1851 census records that exist, that they were lost over time. Some of the 61, which include his father and family, but within the family, they learned most of their masonry trade from him and worked in that area. But I saw a transition when apparently John Henry went to work as to do basic carpentry in shipbuilding on that side of the harbor, because as we know it today, Rodney Terminal and all of that terminal area were all shipbuilding yards, and they lived really in the main town plat at Rodney and Watson Street, which is not too far if anybody knows the west side of St. John and Guy Frenchie's over on that side of the river. That street is one of the cross streets and a main artery. So their family were within walking distance of work. And several within the family did both carpentry and masonry. And then it's not too much of a hop from the knowledge of those carpentry tools to learn the basics of blacksmithing. And if he was into shipbuilding, he would have, knowing him, he would have learned the techniques of blacksmithing to go along with the shipbuilding industry. And so I think that's where he separated between the mason side. Walter was a mason by trade, and he worked on the bridge construction and repair. And then the blacksmith side of the shop was taken care of by John Henry.
That's interesting that they could cross trades so easily. They had to learn to do a little bit of everything, I guess. My final question, because some of them were answered earlier, is Do you think that if Hamilton had taken Miller to court with a lawyer, do you think he would have won?
I have my doubts within the system at the time in the 1870s. It would have to have been a very strong figure that represented him at court. And I'm afraid I call it sort of a subtle discrimination that went on. It wasn't overt, but it was very subtle, because names, which I have been following the change in names in downtown areas of Fredericton where Black populations lived, and you have names which in the press are quite derogatory. For instance, there's a section of town near Smythe Street that was called Whitechapel, and it was only for poor Irish and poor Blacks. There are other names that were applied to other sections of the city in the poorer side that came up in the same way. If you read the press of the period, some of it is very blunt and very forward, and others it's very subtle. You may be hired as an employee, but when it comes to those rights, which you might want to exercise, it depended on your political and economic connections if you were to be successful at it. And I think that would have been the case with John Henry.
Yeah.
I should mention, as an aside from your other listener, that on my Nason side, my grandfather's Hazen Nason, and he had 3 other brothers, and together all 3 of them put in 122 years on the Fredericton Junction to Macadam train station line. And
Wow.
Lee, the last one, was a station master at Macadam.
Oh, that is a lot of dedication for sure. And yeah, the railways are big employers in many areas of New Brunswick. And I read the book a year or so ago. I think it was the Mary Morehouse Diaries. And she mentions a lot about her family, her husband, her son, working on the railway, and also taking in passengers who were waiting for the railway to stop or had to place them overnight. And yeah, it was really big and important in the communities. When you pointed out all the hotels that were built just close to the line, it's amazing. And I don't know if we can fully appreciate it.
And in doing the genealogy, as many of your listeners will know, when they started building the branch in from Fredericton Junction, formerly called Hart's Mills, you can almost follow your ancestors along the rail line, taking up positions as station masters, as freight operators, and as workmen on the lines all the way to Fredericton. The same in Keswick. You wouldn't believe the number of families that readapted and took jobs that were on the railway lines that came up. And of course, other businesses like the hotels that were dependent on that, the stables and the operators to get from the connections to the station and the hotels and the boarding houses, not to mention the grocery stores.
And those that were supplying oxen and horses to move freight back and forth to the train. And yeah,
absolutely.
Brenda has a final comment, I believe, in chat, or question, sorry. She says, do we know when patents could be registered in Canada?
The earliest patents in Canada were shortly after Confederation. And it seems to me that it was just after 1870. I may be wrong there, but because in 81, they had applied for the patent for the improved flanger. But I know there are patents that I've looked at of other natures, and that we're able to get a patent in Canada. Now, of course, even today, when someone register a patent, be it in IT or electronics or something of that nature, their goal is to get it into the US market. And then they will quickly or simultaneously apply to the Canadian Patent Office and the EU, because the next biggest market being Europe in that case. But almost always the goal was to get it into the US Patent Office. And if they didn't get it in the Canadian Patent Office, they thought the market was too small anyway.
Yeah, everything about America was big back then. That's all
Yeah.
right. So that is the last question in chat. I'll briefly open the floor, so to speak, to see if anybody has some questions and will need to unmute themselves to ask them. And don't want to leave anybody out. Okay, I think we've covered everything. So yeah, so that wraps up our presentation. And again, I really want to thank Roger for another wonderful presentation and taking the time to share your passion and research with us today. And I know we'll have another speaker series next year, so I'm kind of looking forward to see what your new research is going to take you next year, and see what you can present for us. So yeah, thank you. And again, you'll be able to access this recording, share it with your friends and your family on Facebook and on the website. And it shouldn't take too long to get it up there. Russ is amazingly quick about that. And I'd like to invite everybody to join us next Sunday for our next installment in our History Speaks series, where we will be having Dr. Michael Boudreau and Dr. Bonnie Huskins, and their presentation will be entitled Just the Usual Work, The Social Worlds of Ida Martin, Working Class Diarist in St. John. So another fascinating presentation next week, same time, same place. Look for our link on Facebook and on our website. And a reminder to like us on Facebook and stay up to date with all of our future news and events. We're going to have an exciting summer ahead of us, I believe. And we're also looking for new members all the time. Now our meetings are on Zoom, but as we move forward, there'll be a combination of Zoom and in person. So people can join us from far away, and they have. From far away is Ontario and points further west. And you can also send us an email on our email, which is Keswick Ridge Historical Society, all one word, @gmail.com. Or you can message us on our Facebook page for more information about our membership, or about any questions you have about the work we're doing in the community. And again, thank you, Roger, and another fascinating presentation. I invite everybody to spread the word to watch this presentation after it's been recorded and put on our Facebook and our website.
And thank you for everybody listening. And I hope in the very near future, when we get over this plague, that we can all meet for the first time in person and
Yes.
and be able to exchange things. So thank you again.
Yes, it's good. It'd be good to put some faces to some names, and I hope to see everybody back next week. So on that note, everybody have a good Sunday afternoon, bright sunny day, a little bit chilly, but it's a nice day to get out and enjoy the weather while it lasts.